It's difficult. There's a lot of pressure on kids to stay on the pitch. And I think these guidelines will actually offer some assistance to the coaches and the referees to say, actually, no, we're taking you off, and these are the reasons we're taking you off. So if there are any parents out there that say, oh no, the kid can stay on, no, there's a reason we're taking them off, it's for their protection.
Thank you all very much. As ever, you can react to everything you hear on this programme, 08085 909 693, and you can text us on 85058 and get to us on social media and react on the news that you hear in the next hour as well.
BBC Radio 5 Live.
The voice of the UK.
Nikki Campbell. Listen on BBC Sounds and watch on iPlayer.
And here is the breaking news that we bring you this morning. The BBC chairman, Richard Sharp, has resigned. We're still waiting for details of a report that's due out now, which was looking at how he was appointed as the BBC's chairman in February 2021. It was considering if Mr. Sharp properly disclosed any involvement he had in facilitating an £800,000 loan guarantee to Boris Johnson, who was the Prime Minister at the time. Let me just bring you that news again. Richard Sharp has resigned as chairman of the BBC. He's given this statement. Let's hear what he has to say today.
Good morning. I would like to thank Adam Heppenstall and his team for the diligence and professionalism they have shown in compiling today's report. Mr. Heppenstall's view is that while I did breach the governance code for public appointments, he states very clearly that a breach does not necessarily invalidate an appointment. Indeed, I've always maintained the breach was inadvertent and not material, which the facts he lays out substantiate. The Secretary of State has consulted with the BBC board, who support that view. Nevertheless, I have decided that it is right to prioritise the interest of the BBC. I feel that this matter may well be a distraction from the corporation's good work were I to remain in post until the end of my term. I have, therefore, this morning, resigned as the BBC chair to the Secretary of State and to the board. It was proposed to me that I stay on as chair until the end of June, while the process to appoint my successor is undertaken, and I will, of course, do that in the interests of the corporation's stability and continuity. Let me turn to the events that are subject of today's report. When I sought in December 2020 to introduce the Cabinet Secretary to Mr. Blythe, I did so in good faith. I did so with the best of intentions, and I did so with the sole purpose of ensuring that all relevant rules were being followed. I am pleased that Mr. Heppenstall supports the fact that my involvement in these matters, as he states, was accordingly very limited. After extensive work, he states, his words, that he is happy to record that he has seen no evidence, and nor could he, to say I played any part whatsoever in facilitation, arrangement, or financing of a loan to the former Prime Minister. Now, during my conversation with the Cabinet Secretary on December the 4th, 2020, I reminded him of the fact that I was in the BBC appointment process. I believed, as a result of that conversation, that I had been removed from any conflict or perception of conflict. I understood this recusal to be absolute. This was my error. In my subsequent interview with the appointments panel, I wish, with the benefit of hindsight, this potential perceived conflict of interest was something I had considered to mention. I would like once again to apologise for that oversight, inadvertent though it was, and for the distraction these events have caused the BBC. For more than 20 years, I've devoted time and energy to public service, whether at the Institute of Cancer Research, at the Royal Academy of Arts, on the Financial Policy Committee of the Bank of England, or as an economic advisor to the Treasury working up to protect British business, including the creative industries, during the pandemic. And for more than 2 years now, I've seen the beating heart of the BBC up close. And for all its complexities, successes, and occasional failings, The BBC is an incredible, dynamic and world-beating creative force, unmatched anywhere. As chair, I have acted at all times in the public interest and for the betterment of the BBC. I'm proud to have fought for the recent return of government funding for the World Service. I've been active in commissioning independent thematic reviews of BBC coverage on touchstone issues, and I've championed the importance of the BBC as a well-funded and impartial public service broadcaster. To chair this incredible organisation has been an honour. The BBC's contribution to our national life is immense. Its people are hardworking and absolutely brilliant, and preserving and enhancing it really matters. Thank you.
Let me just give you the news again. Richard Sharp is resigning as chairman of the BBC, as you just saw and heard. An independent report into his involvement in the facilitation of a loan for Boris Johnson has been published. He accepts that he did breach the governance code for public appointments, which he says the report has found. He says the breach was inadvertent and not material. And he says that the report supports his view of the matter. He says the report, as you heard, finds he didn't play any, quote, any part whatsoever in the facilitation, arrangement or financing of a loan for the former Prime Minister. No evidence in facilitation or arrangement were his very words. Richard Sharp has resigned as chairman of the BBC. In the studio, we've got Richard Eyre, former BBC controller of editorial policy. Hello, Richard. David Sillito, BBC Arts and Media correspondent. David, how do we get to this?
So we have Richard Sharp, the chairman of the BBC, and there is a story several months ago in which it is revealed that he had a role in a loan guarantee that was made to Boris Johnson. It all began with a phone call back in September from a man who is a distant cousin of the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, in which he says, I hear he's in a bit of a financial pickle. I'm thinking I might like to help him out. And then he said that he rang his friend, Richard Sharp, who happened to be working next door to number 10 in number 11. He was helping out Rishi Sunak, who was the Chancellor at the time, with the COVID recovery plan. He is a banker with a lot of financial expertise. That was it. It was all over, and he thought no more about it. Then the job at the BBC chairman came up, and he applied for that. And then after the application, he gets another contact from this man, Sam Blythe, who is Canadian, and says, actually, I'd like to go ahead with it. Can you point me in the right direction, how I could go about this? And he says, well, yes, I need to... you have to be put in touch with Simon Case, who is the cabinet secretary. And he said, I'll have a word with him. And he essentially brings the two people together. And that was as far as it went. However,
Simon Case, the cabinet secretary. So what was his role in this, and what did he say about it?
It's complicated because he is the head of the appointments process. So the full details will come out in the report, which actually hasn't yet been published. But essentially, it was a meeting in December between Richard Sharp and Simon Case, in which Richard Sharp says, I've had this approach. I'm just going to put it with you that he wants to help the Boris Johnson out. And he said that was it. He was told that was it. He would say no more about it. He was recused from the process, and he believes that was the end of the matter. However, he didn't mention it to the appointments panel. He didn't mention it to the Commons Media Select Committee, who are part of the official appointments process. So all of this was, he says, an oversight, an error that he regrets. He said it was inadvertent, but he says the official report, which is due out today, has deemed that that was a breach of the rules, because the governance code, we can actually sort of read it out here, it asks if you have any interests that might be relevant to the work of the BBC and which could lead to a real or perceived conflict of interest, if you were to be appointed, please provide details in your application. He didn't give any details of this, what he says is a very minor role in this loan guarantee that was made to Boris Johnson. But given that Boris Johnson was the man who actually appointed him, it's a clear, very close, essentially helping out someone who might be giving you a job, might be something that people in the appointments panel and the Commons Media Select Committee certainly felt that they should know about. this has been essentially a slow puncture over the last month or two, as people have asked endless questions. For instance, during the Gary Lineker firestorm when he was suspended, a lot of people were pointing out, going, the chairman seems to be notable by his absence here. He doesn't seem to be taking on a leadership role or a public one. So many questions have been asked. And he says the reason he's going today is, the breach, he says, effectively was minor, but all this is proving a distraction and he should go. And he will stay on to the end of June, but that's it.
Yes, let me just read you a statement from the BBC board, which has come in. Richard Sharp has today informed the board he is stepping down from his role at the BBC. The BBC board issued the following statement. We accept and understand Richard's decision to stand down. We want to put on record our thanks to Richard, who has been a valued and respected colleague and a very effective chairman of the BBC. The BBC board believes that Richard Sharp is a person of integrity. Richard has been a real advocate for the BBC, its mission, and why the corporation is a priceless asset for the country at home and abroad. He has always had the impartiality of the BBC and a desire to see the organisation thrive at the forefront of his work as chairman. We understand that the UK government is moving swiftly to begin the process of appointing the new chairman, a new chairman of the BBC, in line with the terms of the BBC's charter. Richard Sharp, chairman of the BBC, said, being the chairman of the BBC has been an enormous privilege. It's an incredible organisation which has never mattered more than it does today, at home in the UK and around the world. I'm very proud to have worked with uniquely talented teams across the BBC. They are the best at what they do, and I shall always be their champion. This is the news that Richard Sharp is resigning as chairman of the BBC. Richard Eyre is here, high Hegian in days gone by, in these here parts, and it's good to see you, former BBC controller of editorial policy. What's your reaction to the news of his resignation?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? The BBC and the chairman of the BBC have got in first with their reaction to a report which we still haven't seen. Just appearing online.
David's going to be going through it with a fine-tooth comb, getting some lines for us.
It's apparently very lengthy, so it'll take us some time before we can say whether our interpretation of it is the same as that which Richard Sharp puts on it. But let's be clear, this was never about Richard Sharp's performance since he became chairman of the BBC. By many accounts, not all, but by many accounts, he's done that job diligently and well, has been a fearsome advocate on behalf of the BBC. And I don't doubt the sincerity of some of his board colleagues when they say they're sorry to lose him. This was about the integrity and transparency of the way in which Richard Sharp, at the very time that he had told the Prime Minister in person that he wanted the job of chairman of the BBC, at that very time, while the Prime Minister was considering his candidacy, Richard Sharp had a second conversation with Johnson's distant cousin Sam Blythe and agreed to put Sam Blythe in touch with the Cabinet Secretary. Richard Sharp says that he did that in order to make sure that all of the rules were followed. Frankly, it wasn't Richard Sharp's business to ensure that the rules about how you want to sub the Prime Minister if he's got financial difficulties are followed. He was then a candidate, and the Prime Minister knew he was a candidate to be chairman of the BBC. Every candidate, and if your viewers and listeners want to check for themselves, go online, Google BBC chairman application, and you will find all of the details about how to apply 2.5 years ago to be chairman of the BBC are still online. It is crystal clear that every candidate has to fill in a form called the Conflicts of Interest form. They have to sign it. They have to date it. There is a link to guidance as to what might be a conflict of interest. Interestingly, the link has been deleted within the last six weeks or so from the DCMS website, but what it said before that was that an example of a conflict which you must declare if you're a candidate is anything which might lead to the perception that your appointment was in return for a favour. Well, he had meaningfully or not, he'd done a favour for the Prime Minister in helping him sort out his finances. He didn't declare that to the assessment panel. He simply told the Cabinet Secretary, who apparently himself didn't pass it on to the assessment panel. This is an issue of transparency and integrity. And both of those there are 7 principles in public office which you're supposed to adhere to. 2 of them, arguably the 2 most important, are integrity and transparency. That's why he had to go.
Okay, just for our viewers and listeners, Richard Sharp, the chairman of the BBC, has resigned. What does the chairman of the BBC do, Richard? I'm very interested in the answer to that question myself. And also, just comment on this fact that Sam Blythe, a distant cousin of Boris Johnson, that's an interesting detail. Some might say an unnecessary detail. I mean, he's a very distant cousin of Boris Johnson. He's related to Boris Johnson in the same way that Danny Dyer is related to Richard III. But, okay, that aside, what is the BBC chairman?
I didn't know about Danny Dyer.
Yeah. Who do you think you are? A fine BBC programme covered that particular issue.
The new system of governance at the BBC, which came in 2016. Before that, there was something called the BBC Trust. I was a member of that, which was entirely separate from the BBC Executive, headed by the Director General, which took all the decisions about BBC's content and programming. There was a report in 2015 which recommended that system be replaced by a unitary board. Unitary board means it brings together outsiders, like the chairman of the BBC, together with a small number of insiders led by the Director General, and they together are responsible for everything the BBC does. So, in theory, the chairman of the BBC is responsible for your appointment, Nicky, and long may it
But not
continue.
in practice.
Not in practice. In practice, the Director General continues to take all editorial decisions. One of the issues that has arisen since this unitary board was set up was that Richard Sharp played a part in the appointment process for the woman who is now director of BBC News. And the reason that he played a part, because that's clearly an editorial decision, is who you have to run your journalism. The reason Richard Sharp played a part was because the Director General chose that the new Director of News was one of those 3 executive members of the unitary board. And because Richard Sharp chairs the board, he was rightly, as chairman, entitled to play a role in her appointment. However, to answer your question broadly, Richard Sharp is there to fight on behalf of the BBC, to ensure the BBC has the right strategy as it goes forward, its financial strategy, to argue with government. And in those matters, he's been apparently very successful, because he knows a lot of people in government, because he's worked with a lot of people in government. He used to be Rishi Sunak's boss. He would be pretty effective in that.
Knows how the wheels turn. We must, and we'll get into the whole issue of whether this should indeed be a political appointment in the first place. But David Sillito is going through the report. We'll get some of the lines that you've pulled out of it in just a second. But let's speak to our political correspondent, David Wallace Lockhart. Hello, David.
Hi, Nicky.
Any political reaction?
Well, no, we've not heard much yet. I think there's still a lot of digesting of the report going on, looking exactly at what's coming out of that. But what we know, obviously, is that many opposition politicians had been highly critical for quite some time about the way that Richard Sharp had conducted himself in going about getting this job. We did get... There are a number of reports into this appointment. This is just one of them. We've already had one from Parliament's DCMS committee, the Culture Committee, essentially cross-party group of MPs, where they had actually gone over the appointments process and questioned whether Richard Sharp had been quite open enough in doing so. It was quite a highly critical report. And essentially, having had a quick scan through today's report from this independent KC into the appointment of Richard Sharp, it does appear that there are similar findings being found there. So I imagine the politicians on the cross-party DCMS committee probably quite satisfied with how this has come out and the ultimate way that this has all ended.
I mean, a highly political issue, but a highly politicised row, David, I think it's fair to say.
That's correct, yeah. And for opposition parties who will, of course, try and make any issue essentially one if it can work in their political favour. There were many factors here at play that did become very political. For one, Boris Johnson's involvement in all of this, and for two, the fact that Rishi Sunak himself, someone who was quite close with Richard Sharp at points in his previous career in banking, he'd worked with Richard Sharp, and he brought Richard Sharp into the Treasury during COVID to help work with the economic response to the pandemic. Now, it should be said, Rishi Sunak wasn't involved in the appointment of Richard Sharp. He wasn't someone who was involved in him ultimately getting that role as chairman of the BBC. But obviously, all those links to the Conservative Party, something that many political opponents had tried to play up throughout this whole saga we've seen, and ultimately that was something that was probably always likely to come into this as a factor.
And of course, Rishi Sunak has placed great store in integrity, transparency and propriety. Thank you very much indeed, David. To other David Silito, arts and media correspondent for the BBC. You've been having a glance at the report. Anything leap out?
Often these reports are very hard to actually sort of decipher. Often it's written in code. This is pretty clear. The successful candidate, Richard Sharp, failed to disclose potential perceived conflicts of interest to the panel, which interviewed candidates and advised ministers. He said the non-disclosures are a clear breach of the governance code. He also talks about the fact that there may well have been a risk of perception that Mr. Sharp would not be independent from the former Prime Minister if appointed. Now, this is all about, did he tell the truth as he was being appointed? And did he tell the full truth? And it's pretty clear here that he didn't. And they said the issue here is that issue about independence. If you look at the job description for the BBC chairman...
But there's no finding about intention, is there?
No, not particularly, but it's the perception. Perception is the key thing. Because the number one issue at the top of the job description of the BBC chairman is to maintain the independence of the BBC. And if by this process there is being a risk of perception that Mr. Sharp would not be independent of the Prime Minister, that's a pretty clear finding there. It's accepting that there was much of this was inadvertent, it was an error, but certainly clearly a perception of a conflict of interest, and it's very clear in the governance code, if you actually read the governance code, that is a breach.
Perception is all, and you can get in touch with us if you so desire. How do you perceive all this? Some pretty negative comments, I have to say, about the great organisation, the BBC, on text at the moment. 85058, you can call 08085 909 693. Alice Enders, Director of Research at Enders Analysis, which specialises in analysing the media. There's plenty of stuff to analyse here, Alice. Good morning to you. And Jake Cantor, Investigations Editor of Deadline, former media correspondent for The Times. Covered media for a decade. It's a long time. Weeks a long time in the media, never mind a decade. Jake, what do you make of this?
Good morning. Nice to speak to you. Well, I think it probably comes down to this for me, that being chairman of the BBC requires fine judgment. And I think it's clear from the findings of this report and from what we've seen over the last few months now, this has been dragging on, that Richard Sharp has not shown good judgment. And I think many of his colleagues at the BBC would share that view. They think that this whole episode has been a really unhelpful distraction for the BBC and has exacerbated the view that the BBC is potentially too close to the government. I think what's interesting here is that Richard Sharp's advantages as chairman have also proved to be his undoing. So he's an establishment figure who's steeped in close relationships with the senior government figures, and that can work to the BBC's advantage. That can be helpful when it's negotiating things like its licence fee settlement. But it's actually proved to be Richard Sharp's undoing because, as the report points out, there is now a perception that he was perhaps too close to the government. And of course, the BBC needs to be completely independent, unscrupulously independent from the government.
We're going to speak to Roger Mosey in just a second, who was controller of Five Live, head of sport at the BBC, and also editor of the Today programme, who's been round the block a few times. But what do you think about this whole issue, Jake, of this position being a political appointment?
Well, look, I mean, this is the way this particular position is designed. It was enshrined in the BBC's charter. And it will continue to be the case for the next few years, unless they go back and undo what is a very important piece of legislation. Without getting into too much history about the BBC and its mechanics, this appointment was perceived to be the best way to go about installing a chairman at the BBC. And I think it's important to remember here that this whole crisis, this whole saga, has not been an issue of the BBC's own making. And this is a government appointment, and the BBC had no say in that appointment, and equally was unable to fire its chairman because it's a government appointment.
Okay, I think we should speak to Roger now. Roger Mosey, former controller of Five Live, head of sport, editor of the Today programme for a while. It wasn't Richard Sharp, Richard Eyre, who gave me the job here. It was Roger Mosey, might I just tell you. Okay. Roger, former BBC apparatchik supreme and now independent voice, sans perail, as they say. Always interesting to listen to.
The man responsible for Nicky Campbell is all I need to...
Resign. That's why you resigned. So was this the right decision by Richard Sharp, Roger?
I think it was. I think it's right and inevitable, because there's a question of what happened in the process, which we've heard about today. But for me, the more important thing was, could this man lead the BBC in future? And if you're chair of the BBC, there's a pretty high threshold. You are the person insisting on the highest standards for the BBC. So it's pretty tough doing that if you are judged not to have followed the best possible processes in being appointed to the job.
Did it have to happen, though? I mean, was it not on a fine line, Roger, or was it in your mind pretty clear that this had to happen?
I think it's because, unfortunately, I think Richard Sharp is clearly a man of talent. And the word from inside the BBC was that he was doing a good job as chair. And there is this sense sometimes in which a political appointment can go happily native within the BBC and be a good supporter of the BBC. And I think that's what people in the BBC felt. But you saw it really during the Gary Lineker affair, where you've got a major controversy about impartiality. You're having to handle top talent in the BBC and insist they stick by impartiality. And you can't do that if you are, A, compromised yourself, and also so tied up with defending your own position that, in public at least, Richard Sharp was invisible during that time. And that's where you need a chair to be out there defending the interests of the BBC and be a person of absolutely unqualified integrity themselves.
There was another perception, Roger, as well. It was, and this has been quite a matter of debate recently, swirling around social media too. A BBC controlled by a bunch of Tories. We're always, of course, being accused of being controlled by one political party or another, or overly influenced by one political party or another. But this was a perception, there's a Tory at the top, Roger, a friend of Boris.
Yes. I mean, we have to recognise that all governments since at least the 1960s have put in political appointments to the BBC, and Labour did it. And of course, Labour had a great controversy with the BBC over the Iraq War and Hutton. And at one point, Chris Patten, a former chairman of the Conservative Party, was chair of the BBC. And I think that's unhealthy, and those days should now go, because the perception is that these people are linked to politicians and prime ministers. And part of the selling point of Richard Sharp was that he got on with Boris Johnson. Well, that now is a rather dodgier proposition than it was even at the time he was appointed. And it'd be much better for licence fee payers if the BBC was a person of just somebody who is not tied to a political party, someone who's defending the licence fee payer. That's their job. It's not because they're mates with Boris or mates with Rishi or mates with Keir or anybody else.
But that's going to carry on for quite some time, because it's a political appointment, because it's in the BBC charter.
Well, the government could now say we're going to run a process which is going to be independent, fair and open, and we will not make a political appointment. The problem at the moment is that you have this weird hybrid in which it actually is a political appointment, but they have this great partial-looking process run by the public appointments people. So it's neither one thing nor the other. Well, actually, in the end, it's a political appointment. I think what they should do is say, let's have an impartial appointments process as a public appointment and choose the best person to defend licence fee payers.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, Roger Mosey, former BBC executive. You can comment on this, get in touch with us. More coming up from Richard Eyre in just 1 second, but let me just tell you that coverage of the breaking news that the BBC chairman Richard Sharp has resigned is continuing on BBC News. We'll keep the discussion going here too on 5 Live and BBC Sounds.
Welcome to viewers joining us here. We are covering the ongoing story in the breaking news this hour, the resignation of the BBC chairman Richard Sharp. He is to resign as the chairman after an independent report into his involvement in the facilitation of a loan for the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson will be published a little later. Mr Sharp accepts that he did breach the governance code for public appointments, which he says the report has now found. Take a listen.
Good morning. I would like to thank Adam Heppenstall and his team for the diligence and professionalism they have shown in compiling today's report. Mr. Heppenstall's view is that while I did breach the governance code for public appointments, he states very clearly that a breach does not necessarily invalidate an appointment. Indeed, I've always maintained the breach was inadvertent and not material, which the facts he lays out substantiate. The Secretary of State has consulted with the BBC board, who support that view. Nevertheless, I have decided that it is right to prioritise the interest of the BBC. I feel that this matter may well be a distraction from the corporation's good work were I to remain in post until the end of my term. I have, therefore, this morning, resigned as the BBC chair to the Secretary of State and to the board. It was proposed to me that I stay on as chair until the end of June, while the process to appoint my successor is undertaken, and I will, of course, do that in the interests of the corporation's stability and continuity. Let me turn to the events that are subject of today's report. When I sought in December 2020 to introduce the Cabinet Secretary to Mr. Blythe, I did so in good faith. I did so with the best of intentions, and I did so with the sole purpose of ensuring that all relevant rules were being followed. I am pleased that Mr. Heppenstall supports the fact that my involvement in these matters, as he states, was accordingly very limited. After extensive work, he states, his words, that he is happy to record that he has seen no evidence, and nor could he, to say I played any part whatsoever in facilitation, arrangement, or financing of a loan to the former Prime Minister. Now, during my conversation with the Cabinet Secretary on December the 4th, 2020, I reminded him of the fact that I was in the BBC appointment process. I believed, as a result of that conversation, that I had been removed from any conflict or perception of conflict. I understood this recusal to be absolute. This was my error. In my subsequent interview with the appointments panel, I wish, with the benefit of hindsight, this potential perceived conflict of interest was something I had considered to mention. I would like once again to apologise for that oversight, inadvertent though it was, and for the distraction these events have caused the BBC. For more than 20 years, I've devoted time and energy to public service, whether at the Institute of Cancer Research, at the Royal Academy of Arts, on the Financial Policy Committee of the Bank of England, or as an economic advisor to the Treasury working up to protect British business, including the creative industries, during the pandemic. And for more than 2 years now, I've seen the beating heart of the BBC up close. And for all its complexities, successes, and occasional failings, the BBC is an incredible, dynamic, and world-beating creative force, unmatched anywhere. As chair, I have acted at all times in the public interest and for the betterment of the BBC. I'm proud to have fought for the recent return of government funding for the World Service I've been active in commissioning independent thematic reviews of BBC coverage on touchstone issues, and I've championed the importance of the BBC as a well-funded and impartial public service broadcaster. To chair this incredible organisation has been an honour. The BBC's contribution to our national life is immense. Its people are hardworking and absolutely brilliant, and preserving and enhancing it really matters. Thank you.
So that there, the statement from Richard Sharp. He will remain in post, we are told, until June. He said he is quitting to avoid a distraction to the BBC. Now, if you're just joining us, you can see there on the screen the news that we're following, that the BBC chairman, Richard Sharp, has resigned. This all, of course, related to the inquiry looking at the circumstances of his appointment and his role in the £800,000 loan guarantee to the then Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. Now, that report finds that he breached two rules while being interviewed for that role, failing to disclose two potential conflicts of interest. Let's speak to the BBC's Naomi Choi-Smith, who's in the newsroom. Naomi, you have that report. What does it tell us?
Well, it is quite a dense report, but really the most essential point, which we'll point at straight away, is this paragraph in the key findings, which is that the successful candidate in this case, Mr. Richard Sharp, failed to disclose potential perceived conflicts of interest to the panel when he was being interviewed for the position of BBC chairman. And that's really what this entire investigation boils down to. Further down in the report, on about page 16, there is a section which says it is the duty of the appointee to disclose any potential perceived conflict of interest. Now, we should say this report does not pass a judgment on whether there was a conflict of interest. They make that quite clear in this area here. It's really more about whether it could be perceived to be a potential conflict of interest. And it does mention in this paragraph here that second matter you brought up, which was a meeting that was allegedly arranged between the then Cabinet Secretary Simon Case and a Canadian businessman who was helping the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson arrange that loan for £800,000. This report here finds in this paragraph that that was not properly declared. Now, we should state, of course, as we've been reporting, that Richard Sharp maintains he did not have involvement in facilitating that loan, but he does accept, as we've been reporting there, that he did fail perhaps to declare these conflicts of interest, potential conflicts of interest. Now, we will go further down. Here's the section that matters. Mr. Sharp does acknowledge that he should have ensured the panel was aware of that meeting I just mentioned between Simon Case and Sam Blythe. There'll be plenty more to pick out from the report, but those are really the essential findings from the public appointments watchdog at the moment.
You'll look through that and bring us any more details. There's a lot to get through, but for now, thank you. And it's just worth saying, as Naomi was telling us, Richard Sharp defending any breach. He says that it was inadvertent and not material. He says he's simply resigning to prioritise the interests of the BBC. But let's just bring you some of the background to how we've got to this position and how these events all unfolded. Well, Richard Sharp, he was appointed chairman of the BBC back in February of 2021. Now, at the start of this year, the Sunday Times reported that he was accused by a group of MPs of failing to declare his involvement in securing that £800,000 loan for Boris Johnson, just weeks before the then Prime Minister recommended Mr. Sharp for the BBC job. Well, his appointment was investigated over his relationship with the then Prime Minister. There was added pressure for the BBC chairman to resign amid the Gary Lineker impartiality row last month. As we said, Richard Sharp, though, does deny any wrongdoing. So let's speak now to George Parker, who is political editor at the Financial Times. George, there is a lot to get through in this report and in the statement that we've had from both the BBC board and the chairman. But this is all about perception, isn't it? That is ultimately the problem here. Perception of who was involved with what and when, and that ultimately has led to his departure.
Yes, as the Heaven Store report says, perception is everything, really. And Richard Sharp allowed the perception, at the very least, to be given, or it could be given, that he got the job as chairman of the BBC because, in some shape or form, he helped to arrange some help for Boris Johnson and his precarious personal financial situation. And in the end, that did create, as he notes in his report, the possibility that people would think that he only got the job because he was helping out Boris Johnson with his finances. And in the end, I think Richard Sharp rightly acknowledged that that was a distraction to the BBC and the independence of the BBC, and I think he took the right decision.
And once again, though, it throws the spotlight on that appointments process that many people may have been unfamiliar with. The idea that the government of the day can choose the chairman of the BBC that prides itself on its distance from government. Will there be more pressure for that arrangement to change?
Well, possibly. As you say, it's not a new phenomenon by any stretch of the imagination for a Prime Minister to appoint a political ally to the chairmanship of the BBC. You could argue that's a sort of function of democracy, that you have someone who is appointed who reflects the mood of the country at any given time, just in the same way, I suppose, that US presidents appoint representatives onto the Supreme Court. But yes, I think there will be questions about that. I think a lot of people will be surprised about the fact that this job has become sort of a political appointment. It always has been, but the fact this episode is put into the spotlight could create pressure for maybe the next chairman, for example, to come from a slightly less overtly political background. Richard Sharp was a political donor, worked as a special advisor to Boris Johnson, so he was plainly very much inside political tent.
Interesting, as you're saying that, George, we've had reaction from Labour, as you would expect. Lucy Powell, the Shadow Culture Secretary, saying that Sharp's breach of the rules has caused untold damage to the reputation of the BBC. She says its independence has been seriously undermined as a result of the Conservatives' sleaze and cronyism. She goes on to talk about 13 years of Tories doing everything they can to defend themselves and their mates. I wonder, first of all, how this will be viewed in Downing Street right now.
Well, I've just been speaking to someone inside Downing Street, and as you can probably imagine, they're very keen not to be anywhere near this story. It plainly is embarrassing for Rishi Sunak because Richard Sharp is an old friend of his. Richard Sharp was a former boss and mentor of Rishi Sunak at Goldman Sachs, the US investment bank, so there is a personal connection. Obviously, these events took place in the Boris Johnson era, and Rishi Sunak's very keen, of course, to divide between himself and the kind of government he's running, with transparency and accountability, ethical and good behaviour at the heart of what he says he wants to do, and the previous administration. But nevertheless, it is embarrassing. Speaking to other people in government, I think it's quite interesting that they think, having read the report, that Richard Sharp did do the right thing, that he was right to step down. But you can understand why Labour are making political capital of this, because it reminds people of the so-called sleaze that enveloped the Boris Johnson government, and also this idea that the BBC or the government was trying to politicise the BBC in a way that viewers and listeners would find unpalatable.
There is a suggestion too that recent Gary Lineker row over the tweets issued by Gary Lineker could have been the final straw in this. Richard Sharp was notably absent, notably silent when it came to any sort of public comment on the actions of Gary Lineker. Is it fair to say that could have been the final straw?
Well, I think the BBC certainly looked immobilised during the whole Gary Lineker saga, and as you say, the fact that Richard Sharp didn't appear to take a view on the subject did leave the BBC weakened. It was a bad episode for the BBC. It looked like it wasn't being properly managed, frankly. So I think, yes, it possibly was final straw. You know, there are some people, including at the BBC, actually, who would say it's good to have a chairman who has good connections with the government, because ultimately the government has to oversee a process of renewing the BBC's charter every so often. And having someone who has good connections with the government can be helpful. But nevertheless, I think in the end, Richard Sharp, as he acknowledged himself effectively, was damaged goods. His continued presence as chairman was a distraction, and I think he had to go.
What happens next, George? The BBC statement says, we understand the UK government is moving swiftly to begin the process of appointing a new chairman of the BBC in line with the terms of the BBC's charter. Will anything change in this appointment process?
Well, I think they'll be going out of their way, I would imagine, to choose someone who appears to be slightly more independent politically. I don't think they'll be going down the route of appointing someone who isn't necessarily a party donor. They'll have had some advance warning of this. I'm sure Richard Sharp will have told the government in advance what he intended to do. He's had receipt of this report for over a week now. His lawyers have been trying to water down some of the conclusions over the last week. So the government has been able to think about this. And as I mentioned, the fact that people inside the government tell me they think he was right to do that suggests that if he hadn't jumped, he might have been pushed. You said at the start there that Richard Sharp intends to stay on until June, so that's another couple of months. But I think the government will want to fill this vacancy pretty quickly. and move on from this rather sorry saga.
Yes, George, we're grateful for your thoughts. Thank you. George Parker there, political editor at the Financial Times. As you'd expect, much more reaction to this news breaking within the last hour. The BBC Live page is up and running on the website if you want to take a look. In the meantime, let's speak to the UK political correspondent Rob Watson, who's in the newsroom. And Rob, we were hearing there are many questions now for how this process works. We'll come on to those in just a second. But what is so enlightening, I suppose, about this report is that it throws a spotlight on how this appointment is made and the role and responsibility of the chairman. Just explain for those who may not know, what does the chairman do at the BBC?
So in broad terms, the chairman is essentially responsible for the BBC's independence and its sort of direction, its sort of planning. Now, that is not to say that the chairman is telling me what to say or telling you what to say. He's not a sort of hands-on day-to-day editor. It's incredibly important that everybody watching this, whether they're here or if they're watching globally, should understand that. He is not in any way the editor-in-chief. It's more a sort of a guarantor of the BBC's independence and as someone who oversees the work of the board. And the board, it's like the board of any kind of large corporation. You know, it is there to make sure that the people who really do run the BBC on a day-to-day basis are doing it properly. Just one other thought that I throw out there, this whole issue about the importance of the impartiality of the BBC as our absolute kind of number one selling points. I mean, the idea is also that those people who are appointed into executive positions, like the chairman, like Richard Sharp, that even if they have, and clearly that was so in his case, even if they have strong links to particular politicians and political parties, that like us, when we walk through the door, when we come into work, they sort of leave any kind of political opinions or affiliations behind and assume the sort of BBC mantle of impartiality. Sorry if that sounded like preaching, Ben, but I think it's worth saying.
No, it is absolutely worth underlining, Rob, and I guess testament to that, the fact that the BBC will report extensively on the good, the bad and the ugly of this throughout the day on its own networks and on its own airwaves. You touched there on the political reaction, and we were talking to George Parker about it. We've heard from Shadow Culture Secretary Lucy Powell. She says it's caused untold damage to the reputation of the BBC. She says it has seriously undermined its independence. We've had a response from the BBC board. They say that they are sad that he is leaving, his decision to stand down. We want to put on record our thanks to Richard, who's been a valued and respected colleague. And they say this in no way undermines the work that he has done. But this is an embarrassing episode for the BBC, is it not?
It is difficult, it is embarrassing, and it's certainly not for the first time. And absolutely, the opposition party and others have said that this is a very difficult moment for the BBC, that regardless of the sort of particularities of this investigation and the fact that it does seem to have cleared Mr. Sharp of, of anything sort of sinister, it was more a lack of reporting. But others have said, well, look, regardless of this case, it just doesn't look great for the BBC to have as a chairman, despite what I said about that idea of executives distancing themselves from previous political relations. It just doesn't look great to have someone in that sort of role who's had that closer link to Britain's political parties and particular politicians. It has happened before, and maybe it's going to happen again. And as you say, I guess the BBC view of how you deal with these things is, yeah, it's uncomfortable. We're not responsible for the board. We're not responsible for the chairman. We just sort of carry on reporting as best we can and as impartially as we can, and that hopefully that will reassure critics. But, it's certainly the case. I remember when this story first broke that a diplomat that I used to know back in the day when I was a BBC UN correspondent, a diplomat from a country a long way from here, sent me a WhatsApp message saying, what's going on? What does this say about the BBC's independence, its perception of independence? So clearly, there is an issue with that, and that the BBC will be no doubt fighting hard over the months and years ahead to reassure everyone, look, we are impartial, we were impartial, we will be impartial.
Yeah, and that word perception will come up time and time again today, won't it, Rob? Because perceptions do matter. And, UK political history is littered with similar cases where people have been perceived to do the wrong thing, later cleared, but it is the perception that has led to their downfall.
Yes, and the BBC is in an amazingly exposed position. I mean, particularly for our global audiences. You cannot overstate the sort of central role that the BBC plays in the sort of daily political, cultural life of this country. I mean, it maybe doesn't have quite the kind of massive total audience share that it once did, but I mean, it is the place where people discuss politics. It has often had chairmen and executives who have close links to the political parties, and of course, you know, while politicians, it's true, politicians across the board say they love the BBC, they recognise this fantastic cultural role that it plays here and abroad. But of course, you know, whenever politicians get any scrutiny, they're quite often a bit less praiseworthy of the BBC at those moments than they are now. And of course, you know, the other problem that the BBC has faced, and this goes beyond the issue of the chairman, it's a more general point, is that as we've lived both here in the UK and abroad in a more kind of polarised world, just being impartial, right, looks partial to people who have a very strong view about things, whether it's Brexit, whether it's anything else. So, I mean, this is going to sound like a bit of an apologia for the BBC, but it is true that the sort of role that it faces, both in terms of its governance and its perception, are certainly very challenging in a time where, you know, we live in a divided world and in a divided country where, my goodness, people have strong opinions.
Rob, really good to talk to you. Thanks so much. That's Rob Watson there, our UK political correspondent. Now, it's worth at this point, amid all of the noise and lots of responses and lots of reaction to that resignation of the BBC chairman, to hear from him himself. He's made a statement. Richard Sharp has issued the statement this morning. Take a listen.
Mr. Heppenstall's view is that while I did breach the governance code for public appointments, he states very clearly that a breach does not necessarily invalidate an appointment. Indeed, I've always maintained the breach was inadvertent and not material, which the facts he lays out substantiate. The Secretary of State has consulted with the BBC board, who support that view. Nevertheless, I have decided that it is right to prioritise the interest of the BBC. I feel that this matter may well be a distraction from the corporation's good work were I to remain in post until the end of my term. I have, therefore, this morning, resigned as the BBC chair to the Secretary of State and to the board.
So that the statement, just a short part of that statement that we had there from the outgoing chairman of the BBC, Richard Sharp. It's worth pointing out at this point too, as all the reaction comes in, we've heard from the Culture Secretary, Lucy Fraser. She's written to the BBC chairman saying, "Thank you for your letter notifying me of your decision to resign. I understand and respect your decision to stand down." She goes on to say, "You've stated the BBC is a great national institution. Over the past 100 years, it's touched the lives of everyone in the UK." She then goes on to say, "I want to take the opportunity to thank you for the work you've done and the leadership you have provided as chair of the BBC." She says, "A champion for what a strong BBC can achieve, not only for audiences at home, but also for the BBC's contribution to the economy and global soft power." She says, "I know that you are held in high regard by the BBC board. You've clearly demonstrated your commitment to public service, and I especially applaud the work you did during the pandemic. Your decision to step down in the wider interests of the corporation is further testament to that commitment." Just quickly about next steps, she talks there about the appointment of the next chairman. She says, "I've spoken to the board. They've proposed you stay in place until the board meeting on the 27th of June. She says, "I've accepted this and would like to thank you for your continued service in assisting and ensuring an orderly and smooth transition takes place. We will move to launch a process to identify and appoint a permanent new chair." So confirmation there, that departure date of the chairman of the BBC until the 27th of June of this year, by which point a new transition process and a new appointment should have been made. So that's the statement there from Lucy Fraser, the Culture Secretary. Lots of reaction coming in on to that news this morning that the chairman of the BBC is to stand down. We can speak now to our media correspondent David Silito, who is in the newsroom. And David, there's a lot of reaction coming in, as you would expect, on this, and once again I'll put it to you, it's that idea that perceptions matter, and in this case it means the chairman has to go.
Yeah, that's what's been concluded today. There are all sorts of interesting elements to this. First of all, what were those breaches actually about? Because this looks like a complicated business about to and fro inside number 10. But It's here on the live page, 2 specific points. One, and the key thing is, who gave him the job? And it's not the BBC who gave him the job, it's the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who gave him the job. He made the appointment. And the 2 key issues here are the fact that Richard Sharp, who was working at number 11 Downing Street with Rishi Sunak at the time, went and had a meeting with Boris Johnson telling him he was going to be applying for the job before he did. That is been deemed to be a potential conflict of interest. And the second one, before he was interviewed, he was going to make the introduction between Sam Blythe and the Cabinet Secretary Simon Case. Essentially, he was telling Boris Johnson that he was involved in some way with something that may end up solving Boris Johnson's financial headaches. Another clear breach of the governance code. However, none of this is actually new. I mean, there was an MP's Common Select Committee report that went into this and said that these were serious errors of judgment. He should have been open and honest with them. And throughout it all, Richard Sharp was hanging on saying, look, it was inadvertent, I accept it was an error, I accept that it's brought some embarrassment to the BBC. But he's fought it all along. However, it appears in the last 24 hours or so, there was a bit of a change of mind went on, and we get the resignation today. Look at the BBC board statement today. Yes, they say they're sad to see him go. They're certainly not saying he shouldn't be going, and there were certainly conversations had with high-up people in the BBC over the last 24 hours that seem to have helped make up his mind.
Absolutely. David, for now, thanks so much. David Salito there. Just to reiterate, that's news you can see on the screen. BBC Chairman Richard Sharp is to resign. He has resigned. He'll stand down at the end of June. A new chairman will be put in place. Full details there on the BBC website. We'll have the headlines for you at the top of the hour.
This is BBC News. I'm Mark Lobel, and we're bringing you live coverage as the BBC chairman Richard Sharp is resigning after conceding a report found he breached the governance code for public appointments. He announced on Friday morning that he will stand down at the end of June after reading the findings of barrister Adam Heppenstall-Casey's review into his appointment, which has just been published. The report was ordered after it emerged he played a role in facilitating an £800,000 loan guarantee for then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, before being recommended for the influential role overseeing the public broadcaster's independence. Well, let's have a listen now to what he had to say when he announced he was standing down.
I would like to thank Adam Heppenstall and his team for the diligence and professionalism they have shown in compiling today's report. Mr. Heppenstall's view is that while I did breach the governance code for public appointments, he states very clearly that a breach does not necessarily invalidate an appointment. Indeed, I've always maintained the breach was inadvertent and not material, which the facts he lays out substantiate. The Secretary of State has consulted with the BBC board, who support that view. Nevertheless, I have decided that it is right to prioritise the interest of the BBC. I feel that this matter may well be a distraction from the corporation's good work were I to remain in post until the end of my term. I have, therefore, this morning, resigned as the BBC chair to the Secretary of State and to the board. It was proposed to me that I stay on as chair until the end of June, while the process to appoint my successor is undertaken, and I will, of course, do that in the interests of the corporation's stability and continuity. Let me turn to the events that are subject of today's report. When I sought in December 2020 to introduce the Cabinet Secretary to Mr. Blythe, I did so in good faith. I did so with the best of intentions, and I did so with the sole purpose of ensuring that all relevant rules were being followed. I am pleased that Mr. Heppenstall supports the fact that my involvement in these matters, as he states, was accordingly very limited. After extensive work, he states, his words, that he is happy to record that he has seen no evidence, and nor could he, to say I played any part whatsoever in facilitation, arrangement, or financing of a loan to the former Prime Minister. Now, during my conversation with the Cabinet Secretary on December the 4th, 2020, I reminded him of the fact that I was in the BBC appointment process. I believed, as a result of that conversation, that I had been removed from any conflict or perception of conflict. I understood this recusal to be absolute. This was my error. In my subsequent interview with the appointments panel, I wish, with the benefit of hindsight, this potential perceived conflict of interest was something I'd considered to mention. I would like once again to apologise for that oversight, inadvertent though it was, and for the distraction these events have caused the BBC. For more than 20 years, I've devoted time and energy to public service, whether at the Institute of Cancer Research, at the Royal Academy of Arts, on the Financial Policy Committee of the Bank of England, or as an economic advisor to the Treasury working up to protect British business, including the creative industries, during the pandemic. And for more than 2 years now, I've seen the beating heart of the BBC up close. And for all its complexities, successes, and occasional failings, the BBC is an incredible, dynamic, and world-beating creative force, unmatched anywhere. As chair, I have acted at all times in the public interest and for the betterment of the BBC. I'm proud to have fought for the recent return of government funding for the World Service. I've been active in commissioning independent thematic reviews of BBC coverage on touchstone issues, and I've championed the importance of the BBC as a well-funded and impartial public service broadcaster. To chair this incredible organisation has been an honour. The BBC's contribution to our national life is immense. Its people are hardworking and absolutely brilliant, and preserving and enhancing it really matters. Thank you.
Okay, let's remind ourselves of the events that led us to where we are today. Richard Sharp was appointed chairman of the BBC in February 2021. At the start of this year, the Sunday Times reported he was accused by a group of MPs of failing to declare his involvement